I thought we'd finally found peace when we moved into Maple Ridge. Quiet neighborhood, low crime, decent schools. But what I didn't know was that the worst threat wasn't crime or noise, it was the HOA president, Nadine Ashford. A woman so deep into her own power trip, she made dictators look modest. And last week, her obsession with order nearly killed my wife. It was a Tuesday night. My wife, Dana, was 6.5 months pregnant. We just finished watching some mindless cooking show when she suddenly doubled over, clutching her belly. Paul. She gasped, "Something's wrong." I didn't waste a second. I called 911, then ran outside to clear the driveway so the paramedics could get in fast. Our house sits near the cul-de-sac entrance, and I knew they'd be here in minutes. But when the red and white lights flashed down the block, they didn't stop. They couldn't. Blocking the entrance to the cul-de-sac like some deranged queen guarding her castle was Nadine. Standing dead center in the road, arms crossed, hair puffed up like she was auditioning for an 80s sitcom. I ran toward her. "Move, that ambulance needs to get through." She didn't budge. "This is private property," she snapped. "Emergency vehicles need HOA authorization for nighttime access." "What the hell are you talking about?" "My wife is having a medical emergency." "She doesn't appear to be outside," she said, peering past me like she was inspecting weeds. "For all I know, you're lying to get around community policy. We've had too many guests parking overnight." I swear, something in me snapped. "She's pregnant, Nadine, bleeding, you're blocking an ambulance." She just shook her head and pulled out her phone. "I'm calling HOA security. You're escalating." Behind her, the ambulance sat idling, unable to drive past her car, which she'd parked sideways across the entrance like a barricade. I shouted at the EMTs, "Go through the yard. The fence gate's open." They had to wheel the gurney through 2 neighbors' lawns just to get to us. By the time they got Dana loaded up, her lips were pale. I rode in the back, holding her hand, fury boiling inside me. The baby was okay, barely. Dana needed emergency surgery for a placental abruption. Another 10 minutes and we might have lost both of them, but I wasn't just furious anymore, I was done. The next morning, I filed a report with the police. I gave them security footage from my doorbell cam that showed everything: Nadine blocking the street, ignoring my pleas, even bragging about community policy like she was enforcing the law. And then, I found something else: Maple Ridge's own HOA bylaws. Turns out, blocking emergency vehicles was not only a violation of state law, it was also a direct breach of the HOA's own charter. But Nadine didn't stop there. She tried to fine me $500 for verbal aggression toward a board member. That's when I stopped playing nice. The morning after the hospital, I sat in our kitchen, staring at the HOA violation notice Nadine had dropped in our mailbox like some twisted trophy. $500 for board member harassment. The fine was typed out in bold, with some ridiculous clause cited about hostile behavior during a certified HOA enforcement action. I poured myself a cup of coffee, still wearing the same clothes from the night before. Dana was asleep upstairs, her hospital discharge paperwork still folded in my jacket. I opened my laptop and pulled up a legal database I had access to from my job in the city records department. I'd seen a lot of petty power plays before. Municipal zoning disputes, land use fights, even a property line feud that escalated to someone bulldozing a neighbor's shed. But this, blocking ambulance access during a medical emergency, that was criminal negligence, plain and simple. I was done treating it like a neighborhood tiff. I printed out the local municipal code, specifically the section on obstruction of emergency services. Then I cross-referenced it with the HOA's founding charter, a PDF buried deep in an outdated website. The document was a mess, poorly formatted, full of contradictions, but it was there in black and white. No HOA officer could interfere with or obstruct city, county, or state emergency personnel in the execution of their duties. I highlighted the clause and stapled it to the police report I'd already filed. Then I drove straight to the district attorney's office. At the intake desk, I met a junior Ada named Kendra Morales. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense tone. "You're saying the HOA president intentionally blocked emergency medical responders from entering your street?" she asked. I handed her the printouts. "Yes. I've got doorbell footage time-stamped. She parked her car sideways across the road entrance and refused to move. The EMS had to go through 2 lawns to reach my wife." Kendra skimmed the police report. "And your wife, she was pregnant? 7 months. She had a placental abruption. She could have died." Kendra looked up slowly, lips tight. "That's felony territory. Obstruction of emergency services resulting in bodily harm, maybe even reckless endangerment." She asked for copies of the footage and documents. I gave her a thumb drive with everything, including a copy of the HOA's own bylaws showing Nadine had violated their internal rules as well. "We'll open a case," she said. "And in the meantime, if the HOA contacts you again, don't engage. Redirect everything through legal." I thanked her and walked out into the sun feeling something I hadn't felt in days: control. By that afternoon, the police served Nadine with a notice of investigation. She tried to make a scene about being targeted and community persecution, but the officer delivering the notice wasn't having it. He handed her the paperwork and walked away while she yelled about selective enforcement and political vendettas. I watched from my porch, arms crossed. 2 days later, I received a formal letter from the city prosecutor's office confirming the charges. Nadine Ashford was being charged with obstruction of emergency services, reckless endangerment, and unlawful interference with municipal operations. 3 separate counts, each carrying potential jail time, but she didn't back down. Instead, she doubled down. The HOA board sent out a mass email titled "Community Integrity Under Attack," painting Nadine as a victim of unjust legal action and claiming the charges were in retaliation for upholding neighborhood standards. Within hours, I started hearing from neighbors. Some were sympathetic. Others were confused. A few actually believed her, so I hosted a backyard town hall. We strung up some old Christmas lights and set out folding chairs. I brewed a huge pot of coffee and Dana, still recovering but sharp as ever, organized the printouts. We had 23 attendees the first night. I stood up and played the doorbell cam footage on a projector screen. The audio was clear. Everyone could hear me yelling for help, begging Nadine to move. They saw her standing there, stone-faced, as the ambulance sat stuck down the block. When the video ended, the silence hung heavy. Then someone finally spoke. "That's criminal," said Mr. Holden, a retired firefighter who lived 2 doors down. "She blocked a medical emergency. I don't care what bylaws she thinks she's enforcing." "It gets worse," I said. "She fined us $500 after the fact for yelling while my wife was being hauled into an ambulance." A woman from the end of the cul-de-sac raised her hand. "She fined me last year for having my niece's car in my driveway overnight. I paid it because I didn't want trouble." I nodded. "We've all been bullied. But now her actions nearly cost lives. This isn't just petty anymore, it's dangerous." By the end of the night, we had signatures for a petition to recall Nadine from the board. We also voted to request a temporary injunction to freeze all HOA fines and enforcement actions until after her criminal case was resolved. The next morning, I brought the petition to City Hall and filed it with the neighborhood registrar. The clerk raised her eyebrows when she saw the stack of signatures. "She must have really made people mad," she said. "She crossed a line," I replied. "And now she's going to see what happens when a community fights back." 2 weeks later, Nadine was arraigned in county court. I showed up early wearing a suit. Dana stayed home, but she made me promise to take notes. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread through the neighborhood, and at least a dozen residents sat in the back rows, arms folded, watching. Nadine walked in with her attorney, a silver-haired man who looked like he charged by the minute. She wore a navy blazer and carried a stack of documents she never got a chance to reference. The judge, a stern woman named Judge Holloway, looked unimpressed from the moment Nadine opened her mouth. "Your Honor, this is a misunderstanding," her lawyer began. "My client was exercising her authority as outlined in the Maple Ridge HOA charter." Judge Holloway held up a hand. "That charter does not override state law, Counselor. And obstruction of emergency services is not a civil matter, it's criminal." The prosecutor presented the footage, the HOA bylaws, and the EMP's written statements. They'd confirmed that the delay added 9 minutes to their response time. That 9 minutes had nearly cost Dana her life. Then came the kicker. The city had also subpoenaed Nadine's phone records. During the emergency, she had sent 3 messages to the HOA board. "He's exaggerating. I'm not budging. Let them find another way in. If we make an exception now, everyone's going to start claiming emergency. I'll fine him later for threatening me." The courtroom went silent again. When the bailiff played the audio of Nadine saying, "For all I know, you're lying," a woman in the audience muttered, "Unbelievable." The judge's face hardened. "Miss Ashford, do you understand the gravity of your actions? You are facing up to 3 years in prison for obstruction alone." Nadine's lawyer asked for a continuance. The judge allowed it but set strict bail conditions. Nadine was barred from performing any HOA duties, contacting residents directly, or setting foot on any property not her own. As she walked out of the courtroom, flanked by her lawyer, a group of us stood in the hallway. We didn't say a word, just watched her pass. The power she'd clung to so tightly had slipped through her fingers, and we weren't done, not even close. 3 days after the arraignment, a letter from the county clerk arrived in my mailbox. It confirmed that the injunction we'd filed to suspend all HOA enforcement actions was granted, temporarily freezing their authority until Nadine's legal outcome was settled. It didn't reverse the fines they'd issued in the past, but it stopped them from issuing more, which was a start. I brought the letter to our next backyard meeting. Word had traveled fast, and this time nearly 40 people showed up. Most didn't even sit, they stood in clusters, arms crossed, eyes sharp. A quiet anger had begun to replace confusion. It wasn't just about Nadine anymore. People were starting to wonder how deep the rot went. One neighbor, Curtis, a delivery driver who lived 2 streets over, came forward with something new. "I used to think all those fines were just annoying," he said, pulling out a folder. "But I've been keeping copies of them. They don't match the violation logs. Half of what they fined me for, like leaving my trash bin out past pickup, was never photographed, never time-stamped, and never matched the dates they claimed. It's like they were just guessing." He passed the folder to me and I flipped through it. Handwritten notes, no official timestamps. Some of the violations had been issued while Curtis was out of state, according to travel receipts he'd attached. Then another neighbor, Alois, a nurse who worked nights, raised her hand. "Nadine came by last month and warned me that if I kept parking in my own driveway after 10 p.m., I'd be reported for loitering my own driveway." Gasps weren't common during these meetings, but that one got a few. Alois wasn't the exaggerating type. I looked around. "We need more than stories. We need real documentation." Dana, who had finally regained some of her strength, stood up beside me with a clipboard. "We're putting together a timeline," she said. "Names, dates, fines, threats, anything that didn't feel right. If we can show a pattern, we can prove it wasn't just Nadine being overzealous. It was systemic." By the end of the night, we had 27 entries. Some went back nearly 5 years. The next morning, I called a friend from my city records job, Miles, an analyst who specialized in nonprofit oversight. He owed me a favor from a zoning case I'd helped him with the year before. I asked him to check the Maple Ridge HOA's annual financial disclosures. 3 hours later, he called back. "Paul," he said, "you're going to want to see this in person." I drove down to City Hall, and he met me in the file room with a stack of documents. He spread them across the table and pointed to a set of quarterly expense reports. "Look here," he said. The HOA reported legal fees every single quarter, but the amounts almost never match up with actual case filings. They're claiming to have spent nearly $40,000 on legal consultations last year alone. There weren't that many disputes, I said. Not even close. Exactly. But that's not the worst part. The checks were all made out to the same firm, Ashford, Langley & Co. I stared at him. Ashford? Yep, Nadine's maiden name. Turns out the firm dissolved 3 years ago, but the HOA kept cutting checks to it. That money went somewhere. And unless someone's been hiring ghost lawyers, I'd bet it went straight into a private account. I took photos of everything and thanked him. As I left the building, 2 things were clear. She hadn't just abused her power, she'd likely embezzled tens of thousands from the HOA budget. This was no longer a neighborhood dispute. This was fraud. I returned home and called Kendra Morales, the Ada. She answered on the second ring. "I've got something new," I said. "Better be good," she replied. Judge Holloway just moved Nadine's hearing up by 2 weeks. I told her about the financials, how the HOA had been funneling money to a dissolved law firm connected to Nadine. I offered to send over the documents immediately. "That's felony-level embezzlement," she said. "Send me everything. If it checks out, we can file additional charges." That night, the neighborhood felt like it had shifted. People were waving to each other more, talking on sidewalks. There was a shared understanding now something had broken loose and we weren't putting it back. 2 days later, Kendra called back. "We verified the payments," she said. The account Ashford, Langley & Co. was supposedly tied to is actually a personal account in Nadine's name. She's been laundering HOA funds into it for years. "We're charging her with misappropriation of funds, wire fraud, and tax evasion." I let out a long breath. "She's going down." "She is," Kendra said. "But we're going to need someone to testify on the HOA's internal procedures, how the board approved these payments, who signed off, what the process looked like." "You want me to do it? You're the only one who's been collecting this much documentation. And frankly, you know more about their bylaws than half their board." I agreed. The next morning, I was officially listed as a key witness for the prosecution. Meanwhile, Nadine tried to spin the new charges. Her latest stunt. A letter mailed to every home, claiming that the recent attacks against her were part of a coordinated smear campaign by outside agitators who don't understand the responsibility of maintaining community discipline. She even accused me of falsifying financial records, despite the fact that the documents came from the city's own records department. But the neighborhood wasn't buying it anymore. The recall petition had reached nearly 70% of residents. We only needed 51 to force a vote. The board tried to stall it, citing procedural inconsistencies, but the city registrar overruled them. The vote was set for the following Saturday. That day, people showed up in folding chairs, on bikes, with dogs and strollers. A folding table at the clubhouse entrance served as the ballot station. Volunteers handed out pens and watched the drop box like hawks. By the end of the afternoon, the results were tallied. Nadine Ashford, removed by a vote of 116 to 32. That evening, the board met without her for the first time in nearly a decade. They appointed an interim president, a quiet, retired accountant named Glenn, who had never once issued a fine. But Nadine's real reckoning came the following week, during her preliminary hearing. The courtroom was packed again. Press had shown up this time, local stations, mostly, but a few regional reporters as well. The idea of a neighborhood HOA president facing felony charges had caught more attention than we expected. Kendra laid out the charges in detail: obstruction of emergency services, reckless endangerment, and now, felony embezzlement and fraud. She presented the financial records, the checks, the fake law firm, and the false legal expenses. Then I took the stand. She asked me to describe the approval process for HOA spending, the typical procedures for legal consultations, and whether any of the transactions in question had gone through proper channels. "They never did," I said. "The board never voted on them. Nadine signed off on every check herself. The treasurer wasn't even aware these payments were happening. She nodded once. And to your knowledge, were any of these funds used to benefit the Maple Ridge community? No, I said. Not a single dollar. When I stepped down, Nadine's attorney tried to argue that the payments were for legal strategy consultations that didn't require board approval due to a clause in the founding charter. Judge Holloway interrupted him mid-sentence. Counselor, your client falsified expenditures, created a shell entity and deposited community funds into a bank account bearing her personal signature. That is not a legal strategy. That is theft. Nadine didn't say a word. Her face was pale, her posture stiff. Her power had vanished, leaving behind nothing but the weight of consequence. The judge set a trial date for the following month. Until then, Nadine was placed under court supervision and restricted from accessing any HOA or financial records. When the hearing ended, I stepped outside and saw Curtis handing out copies of the recall vote results. Alois was chatting with a reporter. Dana stood beside me, arms folded, eyes steady. We built something better, she said quietly, and we're just getting started. She was right. The HOA was no longer a weapon. It was becoming what it was always supposed to be, a tool for the people who lived there. And the woman who tried to turn it into her own private regime, she was finally about to face what she'd never expected: justice. The trial began on a cloudy Monday morning in late October. The courthouse parking lot was already half full when I pulled in. Reporters loitered near the entrance, murmuring into their phones and watching every car that arrived. I recognized a few neighbors among those walking up the steps, people who'd once kept to themselves now lining up to see justice unfold. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with low voices and shuffling papers. A bailiff called for silence just as the double doors opened, and Nadine entered, flanked by her new attorney, a stiff, red-faced man in a blazer that looked a size too tight. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes scanned the room like she was still trying to assert control through sheer force of will. She didn't find it. The judge presiding over the trial was not Holloway this time. A new assignment had brought in Judge Rourke, a sharp-featured man with a dry tone and a reputation for cutting through theatrics. He glanced over the case file without looking up. Defense ready, the attorney cleared his throat. Yes, Your Honor. Prosecution, Kendra stood. Ready. The first day focused on the emergency obstruction charge. The prosecution had built a timeline that left no room for doubt. The EMTs testified first, describing in detail how they had to reroute their gurney through two adjacent properties, navigating uneven lawns and garden furniture to reach Dana. Their team lead, a paramedic named Morales, explained how the delay directly increased the risk of fetal distress. Next came the fire department captain, who confirmed that no HOA or private entity had the authority to restrict emergency vehicle access on any public easement, regardless of community rules. The courtroom grew still as he laid out protocols and the consequences of obstruction. Then Kendra called me back to the stand. She asked me about what I remembered from the night, the sequence of events, Nadine's refusal to move, and my attempts to reason with her. She didn't dwell on emotion. She didn't need to. The facts were brutal on their own. Did Miss Ashford ever acknowledge the medical emergency? Yes, I said. She said I might be lying to get around guest parking restrictions. Did she ever attempt to verify whether your wife was in distress? No, she stood in the road and told me she was calling HOA security. Kendra nodded. No further questions. The defense attorney rose and adjusted his cuffs. Mr. Mason, were you emotionally distraught that night? My wife was bleeding. Yes. Is it possible you misinterpreted Miss Ashford's intentions? I narrowed my eyes. She parked sideways in front of the entrance and refused to move while an ambulance sat behind her with flashing lights on. That's not something you misinterpret. He shifted tactics. You stated earlier that you yelled. Is it possible she felt threatened? I raised my voice because my wife was in danger. But I was 30 feet away and unarmed. She wasn't threatened, she was indifferent. The defense sat down without another word. When the video footage was played complete with the audio of Nadine's voice dismissing the emergency, the room went completely silent. Even the reporters stopped typing. Judge Rourke leaned forward, brow furrowed. Let the record reflect that, miss. Ashford's actions resulted in a measurable delay of emergency response time, as corroborated by the responding units. Day 2 turned to the financial crimes. Kendra began with a forensic accountant who'd compiled a full audit of the HOA's financials for the past 4 years. He pointed to dozens of payments made out to Ashford, Langley, and Co., all of which funneled into a personal account that listed Nadine Ashford as the sole beneficiary. The accountant laid out the scheme in exacting detail. These were not consulting fees, he said. There were no invoices, no email records, no work product. This was embezzlement disguised as legal expenditure. Do you have an estimate of how much was stolen? He adjusted his glasses. $48,223. Kendra moved on to the HOA's former treasurer, a soft-spoken retiree named Harold who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. But when asked whether he had ever approved the payments in question, he was clear. I didn't even know about them, he said. She handled the checkbook directly, said it saved time. The defense attempted to argue that the board had granted Nadine emergency powers during a bylaw revision 4 years prior, but they had no paperwork to support the claim. Kendra pounced. Is there any record, any minutes, votes, or signatures showing Miss Ashford was authorized to write checks without board oversight? No, the treasurer replied. On the third day, the prosecution introduced something: new tax records. Nadine had failed to report the embezzled funds as income over the past 3 years. Kendra handed the judge a summary prepared by the State Revenue Office. Miss Ashford not only stole from her community, she said, she concealed that theft by failing to report it to the IRS and the state tax board. That constitutes willful tax evasion. The judge reviewed the documents in silence. When he looked up, Nadine's face had lost all color. The defense tried to stall by asking for a recess to clarify the financial context. Judge Rourke denied it. You had ample time to prepare. We're proceeding. By day 4, Nadine's posture had changed. Gone was the rigid spine and clenched jaw. She sat hunched, eyes fixed on the table. Her attorney had stopped making eye contact with her entirely. The closing arguments were brief. Kendra focused on Nadine's pattern of deception, that she viewed the HOA not as a civic duty, but as a personal empire she could exploit. She left the jury with a single line. She didn't just enforce rules. She weaponized them for power, for control, and for profit. The defense offered a limp plea for leniency, citing Nadine's years of community service and emotional strain. But the jury wasn't moved. They deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict in a clear, unwavering voice. On the charge of obstruction of emergency services, guilty. On the charge of reckless endangerment, guilty. On the charge of misappropriation of funds, guilty. On the charge of wire fraud, guilty. On the charge of tax evasion, guilty. Nadine didn't make a sound. She didn't look up. Her attorney placed a hand on her shoulder, but she didn't react to that either. Judge Rourke scheduled sentencing for the following week. Before adjourning, he addressed the courtroom. This case demonstrates the damage one person can do when given unchecked authority. It's a reminder that no one, regardless of title or tenure, is above the law. Outside, the mood was strangely quiet. Neighbors gathered in small groups on the courthouse steps, not cheering, not celebrating, just talking. Processing, Curtis approached me with a folded paper in hand. Found another old violation notice, backdated, no signature, might help with restitution. Thanks, I said. But I think her days of writing fake fines are over. Dana met me at the car. She didn't say anything at first, just wrapped her arms around me and held on. The breeze picked up, tugging at her jacket. She's out of power, she said finally. Really out, not just suspended. Not just shuffled around, she's done. We drove home through the quiet neighborhood. The Halloween decorations were starting to go up: cornstalks, pumpkins, a few overzealous spider webs. The street felt different now, not fixed, not perfect, but freer somehow. The fear that had hung over us for so long had finally cracked. A week later, Nadine was sentenced. She received 2 years in state prison for the obstruction and endangerment charges. The financial crimes added another 3 years, to be served consecutively. She was also ordered to pay restitution to the HOA and residents, along with back taxes and penalties to the state treasury. The board, now under Glenn's leadership, reopened the books and issued refunds for every improperly levied fine they could verify. They also voted to revise the enforcement process: no more solo decisions, no more unverified accusations. Every action now required a full board vote and documentation. I declined an invitation to join the new board. I told them I'd help from the sidelines, review policy drafts, and support transparency, but I wasn't interested in holding a gavel. We'd fought hard. We'd won. And now it was time to live. A week after sentencing, our daughter was born, healthy, strong, full head of dark hair. We named her Grace, a reminder of what we almost lost, and what we still had the power to protect. And as I held her in the quiet hospital room, I made her a promise. No one in this neighborhood, not another self-important tyrant in a blazer, not a board drunk on power, would ever stand in the way of someone's safety again. Not while I was around.